So, I mean, we can start with like something like, where were you born and raised, Fraser?
Yeah, sure. So I was born and raised in Edinburgh, actually in Scotland. So I'm now back at Edinburgh University as a postdoc. It's the first time that I've actually been based at Edinburgh University. I did most of my time at uni in Stirling, which is where I actually live at the moment. But I grew up in Edinburgh. Yeah, just quite a, I suppose, sort of normal, unremarkable childhood, really. But yeah, so Edinburgh is where I'm from, yeah.
Okay. So did you spend some time in Stirling as well? Is it?
Yeah, so I did my undergrad degree in Stirling, and then I left for my master's degree. I went and did that at St Andrews, then worked in France for a year after that, and then came back to Stirling for my PhD. Then I
Oh,
actually worked at Stirling for a year after finishing my PhD. So I feel more like I'm from Edinburgh than, sorry, more like I'm from Stirling than from Edinburgh now. I think I'm the most pro-Stirling person ever to not be from Stirling. But but yeah, so I'm still living in Stirling, but working in Edinburgh.
okay. I mean, how long does it take from Stirling to Edinburgh
It,
commuting?
it's about 40 minutes by train, so it's not too bad. And the train service is regular, and I can get a bit of work done on the train too. So it's actually, I find that I work very well on the train, whereas when I'm either at home or in the office, I find a million reasons not to work. Whereas I'm just locked into working. There's nothing else I can do. So much more productive on the train than elsewhere, I find. So yeah, it's actually been helpful having that commute.
Very good. So did you spend some time in France?
Yeah, so I during my undergrad degree, so I worked for I think 7 months in the Franche-Comté region of France as an English language assistant. I was teaching English in a school there. I
Mm,
also did a 4 month Erasmus exchange, sadly missed Erasmus program.
mm,
That was in Aix-en-Provence, so down in the south of France, close to Marseille.
mm.
Then after that, after finishing my master's, I worked for a year teaching English in Toulon, the University of Toulon, which is
Oh,
again south of France, really on the
mm,
Mediterranean coast. It's a big naval port, about halfway between again Marseille and Nice.
mm, mm. So, like, I mean, what's your skill in terms of French language? Can you speak?
Yeah, my French is fluent. I mean, my degree was in my undergraduate degree was in French and history. Um,
Okay.
and I graduated with distinction in spoken language. So I felt that during the pandemic, it was difficult to keep my language up as much as I would have liked, just because I was stuck in Scotland. But since the pandemic's ended, I've been able to get back to France. I've been able to practice a lot more again. So yeah, I mean, my
Mm,
French is fluent. It's something that you always need to be working on to maintain. But yeah,
mm.
I mean, yeah, it's fluent.
I mean, tell us about your PhD project. I mean, what was it on?
What I looked at was it was Islamophobia and community in France through cultural production, and that's in contemporary France. So sort of roughly the texts that I worked on were from 2011 until 2017. So very, very contemporary works. And so I think that there's been a reasonable amount of there's been some really great scholarship on Islamophobia and community in France through the sort of frameworks of the social sciences,
Mm,
which are obviously very important. There's also been work on literature and film by writers and filmmakers racialized as Muslim in France. But that's often focused more on, things like identity formation and protagonists who would themselves be racialized as Muslims, so usually of West African descent, sometimes West African. Um, and some of that, there's a lot of great work being done there. And one sort of problem that I had with it, and I want to be careful how I put this because I have friends who are doing this kind of research, a lot of people who I really respect and who are doing great work. One problem I had, one of the reasons I didn't want to do it personally was that it feels to me that we're not getting the full story about Islamophobia or any form of racism just by focusing on how the people who are the victims of it represent the world. I mean, one thing that Reni Eddo-Lodge says in her book, Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race,
mm,
is that when she's talking about anti-black racism specifically, but this goes for Islamophobia too.
mm,
Anti-black racism, anti-black racism is not about black identity. and Islamophobia is not about Muslim identity. They're both about white identity. These are to do with whiteness. They're not to do with Islamophobia, to take what I work on, has not, in many ways, has very little to do with Islam or with Muslim identities. It's about sort of versions of Islam and versions of Muslim identity that only exist in the racist imagination. And, so one of the things I wanted to do was to look at Islamophobia both through, so I'm still working on works by, writers and filmmakers who would be racialized as Muslim, but also by sort of white writers and filmmakers, including some quite explicitly far-right novels, and then also some others that I would argue reproduce a more sort of liberal form of Islamophobia. And it's reading them to sort of map some of the anxieties, the structures of thought that underpin Islamophobia. And then also reading other texts by writers, both who are, racialized as Muslim and who aren't, which maybe allow for some sort of point towards some more constructive ways of engaging, some of the ways we might think community in a more, inclusionary way. And obviously, it would be asking a lot of any PhD thesis to really give a blueprint for a perfect community. I'm afraid I've not solved Islamophobia, but hopefully it gives some ways of trying to engage more positively, because I think at times there is a risk of just falling into talking about the depressing things, and there are plenty of depressing things that are going on. It's important to talk about them, but I do think it's worth trying to think of more constructive ways we could engage. So that's kind of what my thesis was about. It's currently under contract with Liverpool University Press, so hopefully it'll see the light of day as a monograph at some point. Still very much in an undefined future at this stage, though.
It sounds fascinating, because most of that discourse is all about either bad or like and more kind of negative things going on, and that creates more problem in the community, lots of anxieties from both sides. So you are taking more holistic approach here.
Yeah, so I do start off the sort of first half of the book very much looks at the negatives. So it's the first chapter looks at sort of three of what I call literary great replacements. So it's not writers by sort of novels by writers who are more or less explicitly affiliated with the political far right, and who are depicting these so it's these sort of dystopian future novels that depict a sort of so-called great replacement happening, which there's a really established tradition of in France that I was quite surprised by. It goes back to the late 19th century, actually. So the earliest novels I've found that do this are from the 1890s, but there have been quite a few in recent years too. So I start with those novels, then I sort of look at two films in particular that I argue reproduce a more kind of liberal form of Islamophobia, so sort of a form of racism that tries to justify itself through reference to things like claiming to protect women's rights, things like that. So sort of what Sarah Ferris would call a sort of femo-nationalist approach. So I do start very much by looking at the kind of negatives, but it's the sort of second half of the thesis I do try to gesture towards some of the ways in which we might want to think about what a more inclusionary society might look like. And again, it's very kind of I find the first part where I'm diagnosing the problems a lot easier than the second part where I'm trying to look towards some potential solutions. It's unfortunately always a lot easier to explain the problems than it is to think about how we might try to challenge them. But I do think it's important for me to have that second half of the thesis that does try to think in a more constructive way.
I mean, did you go back to those like colonial memories as well while writing your book?
So the colonial history, in the end, the specific novels and films that I look at they're all post 2011. But the colonial content, the sort of the afterlives of colonialism, I think are, especially in France, but also elsewhere, are really essential to understanding contemporary Islamophobia. Particularly in France, it's the relationship with Algeria in particular is just huge in sort of understanding why there is such a kind of animus against Islam and against Muslims now. So it very much, I would say that the sort of overall methodological framework for the thesis was sort of rooted in post-colonial studies, I would say. It's not, I kind of feel like I fit into quite a lot of boxes without fitting perfectly into any of them, which I suppose is the case for everyone, really. But I find, especially because I'm kind of straddling social sciences and, literature and film, I find that's especially the case with my work. But yeah, I mean, I would say overall post-colonial studies is really a sort of central part of my overall methodology.
I mean, I'm not expert in this area that much, but my understanding is like Algeria is a kind of a special colony, isn't it? It's not a normal colony because of the expat population. And then, coming back from there, there's like lots of, I don't know, like, I mean, what's the right word for this? Is trauma or like disillusionment? I don't know.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, so Algeria was a different kind of colony, first of all, to France's other colonies. So France was present in Algeria from 1830 until 1962. So really a long time, first of all. But also Algeria wasn't considered as a colony in the same way that other colonies were. It was considered a part of France. So Algeria was divided into French departments that were departments of France in the same way that, say, for example, Corsica is. So Corsica is not part of the mainland, but it's part of France. It's part of the nation of France. And Algeria was the same way. Now, having said that, so not the vast majority of Algerians were not citizens. Algerian Muslims were denied citizenship, and it was on the basis of their status as Muslims that they were denied citizenship. So not on the basis of a racial category, but explicitly on that religious category of Muslim. And one of the things I argue is that the boundaries between race and religion is they're a lot less clear than people think. But so Algerian Muslims were denied citizenship. So what you had was quite a small settler class, many of whom had emigrated to Algeria in 1830, sometimes from France, but not always. You had a lot of Maltese or Spanish people who had been promised they would have citizenship if they went and settled Algeria for France. So they went there in 1830, again, very sort of small settler class. And by the time Algeria became independent in 1962, and all of these people were expatriated to France, probably, I mean, a lot of them, probably most, had never been to France. Their family had been in Algeria for 132 years. I mean, to them, they thought they were in France because Algeria was considered a part of France, but they'd never been to mainland France. So they were being, so quote unquote, repatriated to a country many had never visited. In some cases, even their sort of great grandparents or whatever who had initially gone to Algeria weren't French in the first place. They were Spanish, they were Maltese, whatever. So for them, it was, being sent out of the only home they had ever known into what was essentially a strange country, a strange cold country where they also weren't really welcome because they were, the colonists by this point weren't really popular in mainland France either. So it's created a huge amount of resentment amongst that community, amongst the Pieds Noirs community is the name of the settlers in Algeria. So a huge amount of resentment from their point of view. Also the Algerian War of Independence was incredibly brutal and bloody. I mean, there was sort of torture of the indigenous Algerian population by the French army. There were sort of bombing attacks on civilian targets by the FLN, the National Liberation Front. So it was incredibly brutal and bloody on both sides, which created a huge amount of resentment again on both sides. There was also a large indigenous Jewish population in Algeria, many of whom also left after independence, most of whom left after independence. And that's it's become how to put this? So one of the strategies of the French colonizer in Algeria was, I would say quite deliberately, to a sort of divide and rule strategy of deliberately playing the Jewish and Muslim populations off against each other. So there's the historian Ethan Katz talks about the Jewish and Muslim populations in Algeria as being in a triangular relationship with the French state, in the sense that they were always relating to each other and to the state at the same time. And these tensions also live on to the current day and are still being sort of weaponized quite cynically by sort of French political figures in contemporary France to try and maintain or to play on the idea that there is a sort of inherent sort of tension between Jewish and Muslim populations, which is actually very often not being reflected on the ground, but which has been very sort of discursively useful for to promote Islamophobia, and also in some cases it's become at times a self-fulfilling prophecy.
No, that's the fascinating story. I mean, I did not know about that. This divide and rule, because they did the same thing in, like, in our subcontinent. So I'm from Bangladesh, so it's a divide and rule, the same policy. But I mean, how, like, France more or less maintained that anger. It kind of looks like, and then every now and then it's kind of churning up, and the rise of far right groups in France is quite a thing now. I mean, they can win election anytime, looks like.
Absolutely. So one thing, I mean, there's loads to say about the rise of the far right. I watched your video with Sandeep Bakshi, and he talks about it really well. I would say a lot. One of the interesting things about last year's election, so I was talking about the kind of tensions that were created between the Muslim population in Algeria and the indigenous Jewish population. So one of the candidates in the presidential election last year, Eric Zemmour, who he sort of made a name for himself as a real far-right polemicist, writing incredibly Islamophobic and generally racist articles and books, and having this sort of media presence. I suppose the way I would describe him is almost like a sort of French Katie Hopkins or Tommy Robinson, but more successful and with more of a sort of veneer of pseudo-intellectualism. He ran as a candidate in the election, actually outflanking what was the National Front, or now the Rassemblement National, the National Rally, outflanking them on the right. So he has described Marine Le Pen as left-wing, and he is himself of Algerian Jewish heritage. Really, there is this kind of real tension that exists. And again, I should be very clear that I'm not talking, I mean, the vast majority of people of North Algerian Jewish heritage would be, horrified by him. They have no time for him at all. But he's a very significant figure in terms of what he represents. He's also very much, how would I put this? Despite his Jewish heritage, he said some very, very anti-Semitic things about French collaboration during the Holocaust, and which is tried to justify on the basis that actually that the sort of Vichy regime in France protected the French Jews, and it was only the foreign Jews that they deported, as though that's somehow better. But yes, I mean, he's a really sort of indicative sort of figure in terms of the rise of the far right, and he took 7% of the vote in the first round, which is I mean, it's, in some senses, it's not huge. It was never likely to reach the second round, but it's still, I mean, 1 out of every 14 people who voted were voting for this guy, which I think is very indicative that 7% of people looked at Marine Le Pen and thought she wasn't extreme enough.
So, like, if we bring back the contemporary politics, I mean, so do you think Paris bombing created serious tension in the French populace?
Yeah, I would say definitely. So there have been, sort of, it's always, I mean, you've always got the sort of political reactions on one side, the reactions of what political parties did, and that doesn't necessarily always, I mean, it's not always a sort of one-to-one ratio with public opinion necessarily. So there have been some studies looking at, for instance, things like online newspaper comments in online newspaper articles regarding the governmental response, and the governmental response was incredibly harsh, which I'll sort of come back to in a second. And what it seems came back from a lot of online newspaper comments was that people were actually complaining that it wasn't harsh enough, which really, I think, speaks to how much tension was created. I mean, one sort of anecdote that I mentioned in my thesis that I personally find incredibly affecting and incredibly upsetting is that, so thinking about, I know that you asked about the Paris attacks. This is about the Nice attack, on the 14th of July 2016, when the lorry was driven into the Bastille Day celebrations. So first of all, 1/3 of the victims of that attack were actually Muslim. That's based on the kinds of funerals that were requested from the municipal authorities. The first person to die in the attack was a Muslim. Her name was Fatima Shahri. She was a Moroccan immigrant to France who had been in France for decades by this stage. She was in her 60s and wore the hijab. She was there with her family to celebrate the National Day, and she was the first person to be murdered. But what I find particularly, the sort of anecdote I find particularly upsetting is that the following day, when her family went to the site to mourn, they were subjected to Islamophobic abuse. And when her daughter Hanan Shahri, who went on to write a book about her experiences and to set up an association, for the families of people who had died in attacks, when she replied to the guy giving them this sort of Islamophobic abuse, that they were there to mourn their mother who had died in the attack, his reply to her was, "So much the better. That makes one less Muslim." So it's really, it's really horrible stories like that. I mean, I know it's an individual anecdote rather than sort of statistical data, but I think it really brings home the sort of just how intense a lot of this is.
But I mean, at the same time, I think I spoke to Sandeep Bakshi about this, that I think France has got close to 10 to 12% immigrant population, and most of them are actually from these countries. And then when you talk about nation building, you have to include everyone, isn't it? You just cannot exclude 10 million people from the nation building. How this will work? I mean,
yeah. So I think this maybe takes us on to. So again, I know that again, as I said, I watched your video with Sandeep Bakshi, and he talks about some of this. So please, if I'm repeating anything he said, please do cut me off.
no, that's fine. No.
One of the ways in which this has been kind of achieved is through a very specific idea of citizenship that they have in France, which is associated with French republicanism, which is that in theory the republic is considered one and indivisible, which is to say that the republic in theory only recognizes abstract citizens, so abstract individuals as citizens, which is to say that in theory the republic claims to be colorblind, so it doesn't recognize race, religion, or color, anything else as valid categories. All it recognizes is individuals, which all sounds wonderful in theory. In practice, what that often means is that anyone who, so first of all, this idea of an abstract universal citizen, what that means was defined over a period of centuries by the people who were most powerful in France over that period, which was, white, middle or upper class men, sort of heterosexual cisgender men of who would either consider themselves atheist or Catholic, but would at the very least be of Catholic heritage. And anyone who diverges, and the more you diverge from any of those categories, the less you're considered to be an abstract universal individual, and the more you're considered to be particular, which is to say that in order to identify as an abstract individual, the more sort of elements of your own identity you're expected to give up. This is particularly true for religious categories, and particularly true for Muslims. So you'll find that people who identify in the public space as, so whether it's as Muslim or as as black, any sort of sub-state community of identity, so community of identity below the sort of level of the sort of national community, will be accused of what the French call, so what they used to call communitarianism, so communautarisme is the French word, which is it's a sort of kind of voluntary self-segregation, as they see it, of refusing to be a part of this national community, which wants nothing more than to include them, but these people exclude themselves. And that's actually been, so the word communautarisme has recently been replaced by separatism, so separatism, which has made its way into law, and it's the sense that people are deliberately separating themselves. And this is an accusation that's aimed particularly at Muslims, that people are deliberately separating themselves from the national community. And I think there was something else I was going to add there, which has slipped my mind.
That's okay. Yeah. No, I mean, it's quite frightening, isn't it? I mean,
Yeah.
it really worries me. I mean, how then, how this will end then? I mean, what's the plan here?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult, isn't it? So yeah, so I mean, so this is all, it's this, what I think is most difficult in the French context is that there's this particular sort of vocabulary associated with the Republic and associated with republicanism, which allows a kind of apparently sort of virtuous veneer to be placed over what's basically just racism. You know, people who speak up on the basis of racism they are already facing are accused of themselves as being racist because they want to separate themselves into this community of race, when actually, I mean, they're already facing this racism and they're just trying to respond to it. And I think what's difficult with this Republican discourse is that, so historically it was associated with, with the political left.
Mm.
And that means that you've got a sort of situation where the right has very much now appropriated this discourse. It's become politically useful for them to do that, to pick up this discourse, even though they used to be, I mean, we're even talking about elements of the far right that were hostile to the very idea of France being a republic until quite recently. They were hostile to things like secularism. They were very much associated with, the Catholic right. They weren't, necessarily pro-democracy. They weren't in favour of any of these things. Now they've realised that it's a very useful way of, continuing to promote the same racism they always have, while not being explicitly, not saying things that are explicitly racist. So that's one part of it. On the other side, you've got, the sort of political left and centre who, so there can be a few reasons why they might also appropriate this sort of, this sort of chauvinistic form of republicanism. One is the sense of not wanting to distance themselves from a value that was historically seen as being left-wing, or also just, being racist. I mean, there have always been racists of the left. It's not really new. But what it really means is that it's very difficult to, to have a space where, the kinds of anti-racism that we see in the sort of Anglophone world can't even be articulated, because any of these are immediately denounced as, communitarianism, as separatism. And even, even sort of elements of the radical left have been guilty of this. So one figure who has sort of come to embody the sort of what would traditionally have been seen as the left wing and is now considered the far left in France is Jean-Luc Mélenchon. And his own, so I should say that there are, I think, some really good people in his movement doing great work in his party, but his own personal history with race is actually very problematic. He's consistently voted for, legislation against the headscarf, legislation against the veil, things like this. And not only has he done that, but he's kind of sort of outspokenly brought up the fact that he's done that whenever anyone's accused him of being too anti-racist. He also, as recently as 2020, so there was the murder of the school teacher Samuel Paty by a guy called Abdullah Anzarov, who was a Muslim of Chechen descent, Chechen heritage, who, had been sort of, radicalized online, and he murdered the school teacher Samuel Paty for showing a caricature of the Prophet Muhammad in class. And what Mélenchon said after this was that France had, and this is a direct quotation, that France had a problem with the Chechen community, and that he then went on to suggest that Chechen people should be placed under surveillance, and that any who were associated with, again, quote unquote, radical Islamism should be deported. So this is the guy who's meant to embody, you know, the radical left. There's so little space within French politics to embody anything that looks like anti-racism. So I think the second part of your question is, how do we face this? And the answer is that it's really difficult. I mean, I think there needs to be a mass movement. And one of the things that, and again, that Sandeep Bakshi said in his interview with you, in your interview with him, was that, you know, white people aren't doing enough, and I would agree with that. I mean, when you see the way that French people will take to the streets over things like, so we've got pensions reforms at the moment, there was the Gilets jaunes a few years ago. When you look at the way they'll take to the streets over that, the sort of absence of anything on, you know, structural racism or on Islamophobia it's really depressing. I think one of the things that I argue in my thesis is that we need to sort of rehabilitate the utopian imagination to be able to sort of articulate something that's like a sort of utopian politics of inclusion. Because I think exclusion that we're seeing at the moment, whether that's particularly far right, but also sort of, you know, jihadi discourse, anything like that, they are promising, you know, utopian futures for those who are included, even if they are, you know, utopias of exclusion that are predicated on dystopia for those they exclude. They are very much speaking in utopian language. Sort of utopianism, you know, whether it's of the left or just of, you know, a more inclusionary vision of what community could be, completely discredited. And I think it's something that we need to rehabilitate. So that's one of the things I argue in the thesis. But again, it's very easy to say these things. How do we do it in practice? I wish I had a more concrete suggestion for how we actually do that, how we sort of take up that space. As I said, there's very little space within the French discursive space for this to happen. Yeah, I wish I could say something a bit more cheerful, but it is difficult to see how we would do that in concrete, you know, in concrete terms.
Like in terms of academia, like how much they are doing in terms of this kind of research area.
So this is really interesting. There are some French scholars doing amazing work in this field. So people like, so for instance, one of the works that I sort of cite constantly in everything I write is called Islamophobie, comment les élites françaises fabriquent le problème musulman. So Islamophobia, how the French elite create the quote-unquote Muslim problem. And that's by Abdelali Hajjat and Marwan Mohammed. There's also Saha Mazouz, who's doing great work in this area, a few other people, sort of whether it's in, you know, in academia or in the, you know, the sort of the space of public intellectuals, which is more kind of more existent in France than it is here in the UK. We don't really have many public intellectuals in the UK. They are more of a thing in France, for better or for worse. So there are people doing great work. They do seem to be, so there's been a lot of sort of work showing that people doing this kind of work are really marginalized in French universities, which I think again comes back to this vision of republicanism, whereby they will talk about, they don't deny that so when I say they, I mean people who, I'm not talking about all French people, I'm talking about, you know, Republicans or neo-Republicans. They will talk about things like racism, but they treat it as an individual issue. So racists are bad people who do bad things, and the way that we challenge that is by, you know, punishing them as individuals, when in reality these are structural issues. And anyone who talks about, you know, things like structural racism in France is just completely you know, completely persona non grata. They're really marginalized within the academic space. And despite that, there's been a real campaign from the current government, actually, the sort of self-styled centrist government, who seem to, you know, view centrism as like constantly making overtures towards the right while also attacking the left. That seems to be their vision of centrism. They've really had this overt campaign against what they call, and it's a horrible word, Islamogauchisme. so Islamo-leftism in universities. And it's like, it is just so caricatural. But this Islamogauchisme, so it was a phrase that sort of started out in the French far right to sort of designate anyone who's, you know, talking about Islamophobia, talking about racism, talking about structural racism. They would be accused of being Islamogauchistes, Islamo-leftists. But it has now made its way into the sort of discourse of the current government. So both the former education minister, now he lost his post, but the current higher education. No, she's not. I'm not sure if she's still the current minister. Actually, there was a government reshuffle after the election, and I can't remember if she kept her post. But the higher education minister in 2021, so very recently, she was talking about how they need to set up a commission to weed out this Islamogauchisme in universities, which was apparently sort of causing ravages, in her words, within universities. Which is, I mean, as I say, it's the complete opposite is actually happening. But the sort of discourse that they have, and this is very close to it's very close to some of the discourse we see in, you know, in the Anglophone world about these things, about this idea that, you know, that universities are full of so-called cultural Marxists who are, you know, indoctrinating children, well, students, I should say, sorry, to be activists. None of the students see me calling them children by mistake there, but you know, the sense that we've got cultural Marxism that's indoctrinating children to be activists, and they're even using some of the same words in sense now. So another awful word which has made its way into the lexicon is le wokisme. So that's wokeism, but in a French accent, which again, so a lot of this sort of culture war stuff is, again, I think it's distinctive to France in the sense that the Republican ideology creates a specific vocabulary in which these kind of claims are acceptable and can be articulated across the political spectrum. A lot of the time they are basically saying quite similar things to what we're seeing in sort of culture wars discourse elsewhere too.
Like, I mean, in terms of economy, like how much economy is playing game here? It looks like, you know, France doesn't have enough resources to actually, you know, redistribute wealth, and then that, how much that kind of anxiety create problem for, you know, who's in and who is out.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say so again, very, very often the sort of, again, I want to avoid generalizing statements here. So people of post-colonial immigrant descent, including Muslims, are sort of overrepresented, you know, on the margins of society. Sort of overrepresented in deprived areas, so the deprived sort of suburban banlieue, as they're called, which I think, again, Sandeep actually mentioned in your interview, the sort of areas in the outskirts of cities which were built in sort of 1960s to house immigrant populations, and which very quickly became sort of de facto ghettos. Sort of overrepresented in these areas. Again, I'm saying overrepresented because I don't want to imply that these areas, one of the things you'll often see in the French media is an implication that these areas are made up entirely of non-white people, which isn't the case. You also see it kind of almost implied that all non-white people live in these areas, which also isn't the case. There are, I mean, people doing very well for themselves, and so there should be. But yeah, so there is very much a perception that there's a sort of equation of these deprived areas, and you know, people who aren't white. And again, in these areas, as is sort of always the case in areas where there's a lot of social deprivation, there has been a rise in things like, you know, crime rates and so on, which is correlated with, sort of consistently correlated with poverty, but which then within sort of political discourses is often sort of implicitly or explicitly attributed to this kind of supposedly sort of inherent criminality of, you know, sort of people of post-colonial immigrant descent. And I think there have been some quite certain figures have very openly tried to use this to promote racism. So I've just sort of described one sort of quite simple mechanism whereby that happens, where, you know, the sort of crime rates in poor areas are attributed to some kind of, you know, inherent criminality. There's also this, well, a couple of discourses whereby poverty in these areas, which does tend to get a reasonable amount of media coverage, is sort of compared unfavourably with, say, poverty in either the countryside or what has been called la France périphérique, so sort of peripheral France. So not so much, the suburbs of big towns, but sort of smaller towns. And these areas are, again, I don't want to make generalizing statements. These areas are understood in the popular imagination as being white, whereas the sort of suburbs of big cities are understood as being non-white. Again, so demographic realities are more complex, but that's how people understand these areas. And what you'll see politicians trying to do, sort of politicians on the right and the far right particularly, is try to play the concerns of these areas against each other. So they'll say that there's been too much attention paid to the suburbs of big cities, and that the countryside has been neglected, which is a sort of cipher for we're being too nice to people who aren't white, and sort of neglecting the poor white people, which again is sort of used to stoke racial tensions. Again, a sort of similar divide and rule strategy to what we were discussing earlier. So that has definitely been a strategy. And this is, again, one of these things that has quite often been the case with the political right, but it's also been the case with figures associated with the political left who have done this. So there's a guy called Christophe Gouy, who's a kind of geographer, and his big thing is peripheral France. His big thing is, too much of the resources that France's have are being distributed to these big cities, including the suburbs. And that's leaving, the poor white people on the periphery to starve. So it's very much trying to create, ethnic tensions. And again, it's something that you see in France. It's also something that you'll see in the UK and the US particularly. So I know that in the UK we had what was that guy? Goodhart, someone Goodhart. He talked about people from somewheres and people from nowheres. So the some nowheres, and a lot. So there's this sense that people living in big cities were from nowhere; they could live anywhere. Whereas people in the sort of rural areas are from somewhere. They're sort of rooted in that place, but are then sort of neglected. And again, you would see a lot of discourse around Brexit being attributed to the sort of the Red Wall, who sort of people who were seen as being white people in the north who had been excluded from politics, while people in the more diverse south of England, and particularly London, had been focused upon. And then Brexit was sort of there, it was seen as almost like a working class revolt in some quarters, including, so I remember like Nigel Farage described it as this. That's former banker Nigel Farage, who's never expressed any concern for working class people in any other context. You also saw, like, similarly, the votes of voters in the American Rust Belt for Donald Trump being attributed to the same mechanism, whereby this sort of billionaire property heir was depicted as somehow representing this so-called white working class against the sort of threatening others. So again, these discourses we see in France, I think, are replicated elsewhere in the world. Certainly these ones around economics and around the sense that there's not enough for everyone, so there's got to be this inherent competition between racial groups over who can have the resources.
No, I was reading a recent book, University of California. He was saying that the way things are now, 20% of world's population now own 95% of the world's wealth. So basically 80% are now relying on just 5% wealth.
Yeah.
So when you have this segregation in like France or UK and like USA, you can see the tension, isn't it?
Yeah, it's this sense that rather than redistributing the 95% that this top 20% have, rather than redistributing that, you need the remaining 80% to sort of fight amongst themselves over this remaining 5%. Yeah, so that's very much, I think, it's something that we see worldwide, and it's certainly, I think, replicated in France.
And I saw like around $32 trillion now sitting in the so-called tax haven. So this is from tax evasion, you got that amount of money. And I also saw that to make poverty history, you need $175 billion a year for 20 years. So that's
Yeah.
like 3 trillion. You can make poverty history. But if you look at the, America's global war on terror, for 20 years, that cost 8 trillion. So like lots of things are like, some of the things are just global, isn't it? And then kind of like knock-on effect on those peripheries in Paris, in London, all those places, the big cities now. Um, so like, I mean, what will be your policy advice like for, France? I mean, what is the like, like where people can try to understand that, what's happening here?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose policy advice. I guess that I'm quite pessimistic about the idea that policymakers are even really interested in tackling these problems. So I think for me, I would almost be tempted to say to put the hope less in policymakers than in people and social movements.
Mm, mm,
I think that one thing that we saw, and it almost feels like a bit of a cliche to bring it up now, but that we saw in the summer of 2020 with the kind of global wave of protests that followed the murder of George Floyd.
mm,
We saw that when people come together to protest these issues, change can come.
mm,
And again, it's not, I suppose, clear how durable or how long lasting those changes will be. But I
mm,
think more was achieved through those protests and has been achieved through decades of liberal democracy.
mm, mm,
I'm quite, I guess, quite pessimistic about the ability of democracy in its current form to effect meaningful change, or even the willingness of people involved in democratic structures. Again, so as I was saying earlier, this is one of those places where I can make quite a vague point in the same way that I did with the need for the return of utopianism. I'm less clear on what would replace democracy with. I mean, none of the options have been better,
mm, mm,
but yeah, I mean, definitely, I guess that definitely in terms of giving policy advice, I would just be quite pessimistic about the idea, even in a sort of globalized world, that even if policymakers were in good faith and wanted to make changes, that they even still have the power they would need to do that. I mean, when so much has been deregulated.
mm,
So yeah, I mean, it would very much be in social movements that I
mm,
would put what faith I try to maintain.
mm, mm. No, that's a good point. That's quite like reflective as well. It's people. People will decide what they want, isn't it? It's
Yeah,
us. It's us. What kind of society we want,
yeah,
And
absolutely.
if we want a society which is very hurtful to other people, I don't want to be part of that society.
Yeah.
So that kind of like philosophical understanding about us, about this planet's, well-being. I mean, I think that needs to be more understood in a more reflective way.
Yeah. So I mean, one of the things I do sort of suggest in the last half of the thesis, which again is very it's very, I suppose, speculative in some ways, but I like the idea of a politics of friendship. So this is something that Leela Gandhi writes about, which is drawing on people like Derrida and like Jean-Luc Nancy, and but this idea of a politics of friendship is actually being a really powerful sort of trope
Mm,
for sort of effective connection between people on a sort of very sort of on a level that kind of so what you connect with people through is their differences, the differences between us that make relationships between us meaningful. It's by
mm,
connecting we're different from ourselves that we build meaningful relationships. And one of the things that I try and suggest is that politics based on friendship rather than what we have now, which is very much often implicitly or explicitly the idea of the nation state as a kind of family, which
mm,
presupposes the idea of ideas of blood relationship, which always exclude people who look different or people who are who don't have the same sort of belief systems as each other. This idea of basing a politics on friendship, I think, is quite a powerful way of starting to overcome some of these divisions that we have in society. And again, it is one of these things that's very easy to say, and it's less easy to sort of build a program based upon. But I do think it's important to sidestep the idea that change is going to come from above, because I think we've seen over decades now that's not going to happen, unfortunately. So it does need to, in the way we relate to each other, that change has to come, I think.
Thank you so much, Fraser.
Thank you.
It's an absolute pleasure. I learned so many things, but also I think these are important talks. And the more talks like this, people can at least try to understand like what's happening.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for inviting me. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much. So I might invite you again, time to time.
Yeah.
But you are a brilliant scholar. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your time.